It is no secret that the wastes in Fallout are contaminated beyond belief with ungodly levels of radiation even after 200 plus years. At surface level, this doesn't make any sense, but I hope to get to the bottom of this question during this video. But first, please do me a favor if you enjoy by leaving a comment, like, and subscribing to help get this and other content of mine out into the world for others to enjoy. So obviously the Great War is to blame for the Wasteland as we see it today. The 2-hour-long conflict completely changes the landscape and climate of Earth during the initial massive exchange that threw tons of ash and debris into the atmosphere when massive firestorms swept through cities across the globe after the nuclear strikes. But what we're interested in today is the nuclear fallout, or radioactive particulates that are mixed in with the thick clouds of ash. Understanding this is key to the video. The problem lies with most nuclear weapons today being thermo-nuclear, also known as multi-stage or hydrogen bombs. These weapons are designed for utter explosive power to obliterate a city and not to leave large amounts of radiation behind. Most of the radiation from these weapons is released in the days and weeks immediately following the attack, when the short half-life isotopes rapidly break down into more stable forms. Iodine-131, for example, makes up a large proportion of the fallout and has a half-life of just under 8 days. A pound, for instance, would decay to half a pound after 8 days, then a quarter pound after 16, 1/8 pound after 24, etc. until all decays into more stable forms. So you can see the pickle we're in here. By the time of Fallout 3 taking place, 200 years have passed, so the amount of iodine-131 and other short-lived isotopes like it remaining would be minuscule, 0.011% to be precise for iodine-131. So what if the intentions of the Chinese were not just to destroy modern America with their nukes, but also to prevent future generations from using the land by irradiating it so much that everything would be killed or at least severely stunted? This is the concept behind salted bombs, which get their name from the phrase to salt the earth, meaning to raise the ground so nothing will grow and making the area inhospitable to life. Salted bombs do this by maximizing the radiation released from the nuclear explosion. There are 4 proposed types of salted bombs, but the one utilizing Cobalt-60 may be the magic one we need. This spicy isotope has a half-life much longer than iodine-131 at 5.26 years and emits a lot of shortwave, extremely dangerous gamma radiation when it decays, meaning that by the time of Fallout 3, 2.63% of the original concentration still exists. A much richer concentration than that remains at iodine-131 and other isotopes. However, salted bombs are much more expensive to manufacture than typical nuclear weapons, and they tend to be lower yield, so the radiation release is concentrated within the blast area and not thrown miles into the atmosphere to be spread across the globe. These two factors limit their usefulness as city destroyers, so alternatively, multi-purpose low to medium yield fission weapons may have been employed during the resource wars as a cost-saving measure by countries that were struggling to maintain a stockpile. For those of you who don't know the difference between fission and fusion weapons, fission is where heavy elements such as uranium-235 or plutonium-239 are broken into smaller elements when fast-moving neutrons strike them. These are also known as atomic weapons. Fusion is the exact opposite, where light elements like hydrogen-2 and 3 are forced together under immense pressure to form helium and release an ungodly amount of energy. These are also known as multi-stage weapons and require a fission core as the first stage to jumpstart the subsequent fusion stages, which multiply the explosive power. One of the side effects of a fission bomb is a moderate amount of cesium-137 and americium-241 expels when detonated, that then rains down around ground zero, causing a similar, if not scaled down, effect to a salted bomb. This isotope of cesium is particularly nasty, with a half-life of 30 years and produces tons of gamma radiation when decaying, just like Cobalt-60, while americium isn't much better, with a half-life of 470 years, meaning by the time of Fallout 3 taking place, 15% of the original cesium-137 and 57.45% of americium-241 is still in the Wasteland, meaning these isotopes have a long enough lifespan, potentially cause problems if enough is concentrated within the region. But that still leaves a question as to why anyone would build massive amounts of fission weapons when fusion is much more powerful. And this brings us to the mindset split between our real world and that within Fallout when talking about tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. For those of you who don't know the difference, tactical nuclear weapons are designed for use on the battlefield in support of a military operation, such as destruction of enemy concentrations or possibly infrastructure like supply depots and military bases, while strategics are city destroyers. The main defining feature between them are yield. Tacticals top out at around 100 kilotons usually, while strategic can be anywhere between 250 kilotons and 20 megatons or more. The mini nuke, for instance, has around a ton of TNT explosive force. Little Boy, which destroyed Hiroshima, is 15 kilotons, and Castle Bravo is 15 megatons. For reference, a megaton is 1,000 kilotons of TNT explosive power equivalent, which is itself 1,000 tons of TNT. So Castle Bravo was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, or 15 million tons of TNT. And this difference is important to understand because we can look back in the history of Fallout and see what precedes the Great War, the European Commonwealth, Middle East, and Sino-American Wars to be precise, which changed how in-universe tacticians and generals view these bombs. During the ECMA War from 2052 to 2060, the first use of nuclear weapons since World War II, which took place 107 years ago, occurred, and possibly first operation deployment of strategic weapons as well. Cities across the Middle East were bombed what is known as the Middle East nuclear crisis, which was caused by the destruction of the Israeli city of Tel Aviv by a terrorist nuclear attack. This ushered in a wave of reprisals from the Europeans, who targeted major cities and industrial sites across the Middle East, who then retaliated in turn by targeting cities that had been occupied by the Europeans with their own nukes, bringing the war to a breaking point when the world teetered on knife's edge between atomic doom and de-escalation. Most of the weapons used were possibly low-yield tactical nuclear weapons, but there are mentions of entire cities being destroyed, so those few were probably strategic weapons. And as for the Sino-American War, we don't know if any strategic nuclear weapons were used, but tactical nuclear weapons sure were, most notably the large-scale deployment of Fat Man nuclear catapults by America in the closing years of the war, which fired the football-sized mini-nuke. But a significant incident occurred at the beginning of the war when the USS Abenatola was sunk in a tragic friendly fire incident by a nuclear-tipped torpedo fired by the USS Interference. This torpedo's warhead would be classified as a tactical nuclear weapon since it was designed to be used on a battlefield against a specific target and not fired into a harbor. And we don't need to theorize about tactical fission weapons making up a large proportion of pre-war stockpiles. The Sentinel Titan IV has hundreds of Mark 28 tactical nukes that were being adopted for use on ICBMs before the Great War, but the most notable example of a tactical weapon is the atomic bomb with a heart of megaton, which is modeled off the Fat Man plutonium bomb we dropped over Nagasaki in 1945. The bomb's yield in-game is really nothing spectacular at around 10 kilotons, I estimate, but the fallout it produces is intense, making me think this was a salted weapon. And this isn't a one-off atomic bomb that America just had laying around. Dozens are in Fort Constantine that were never used. Now admittedly, the weapon may have been much more powerful when first designed, but has since lost efficiency with age. Specifically, I think these were boosted bombs, which is where a pocket of fusion fuel is located within the core to provide a burst of neutrons to induce rapid fission before the weapon destroys itself, possibly pushing these bad boys beyond the half megaton yield. But we don't know because the tritium within, that is half the essential fusion fuel components, has a half-life only 12.3 years. So by the time of Fallout 3, most of it had decayed to helium-3, which when fused, doesn't release the neutron burst required to boost fission. So with that settled, we can conclude that all nuclear parties on Earth that stockpiled massive amounts of tactical weapons because by this point in history, it had become an acceptable military strategy to lob low-yield nukes at each other. This is significant because most fission weapons, except for those wickedly powerful ones, fall squarely into the tactical category at around 50 kilotons, and would have been mass-produced as a cheap alternative to low-yield fusion weapons, making them readily available for the big kaboom, as the Voltec sale rep put it, with the happy side effect of spreading copious amounts of long-lived radiation everywhere. Anyways, the mere existence of these bombs and many others within the post-apocalyptic wastes is quite telling of the pre-war mentality towards war and the public mindset. Honestly, it goes a long way in explaining how Voltec rose to be the most profitable company on Earth too. The US civilian population was terrified of escalation from battlefield attacks to strategic. And for good reason. The most powerful weapons ever created were being used on a regular basis. But how useful would tactical nuclear weapons be during the Great War? Well, that all depends on the nation's strike ability and how many weapons they can get airborne before they themselves are destroyed. For example, the Chinese had presumably thousands of ICBMs at their disposal and pursued a strategy called saturation bombing, where basically everything and the kitchen sink was thrown at America to both overwhelm defenses and utterly annihilate the country. Basically a nuclear carpet bombing. This was best seen in New Vegas, where the city and the surrounding area were targeted by 77 ICBMs. Some of these were undoubtedly strategic weapons like the mass one we saw hit Boston, but most would have been low-yield nukes that saturated the target with overlapping blast areas to best use the explosive force and maximize fallout coverage. which is probably what happened to DC. Or alternatively, the weapons could be concentrated in a small area to create locations like the glowing sea in The Glow, where most of the contaminants collect, but enough settle down the surrounding area to heavily irradiate it. Which brings us back to the original argument. I would say that what we covered here points to China, America, and the rest of the world having a nuclear arsenal mostly composed of fission tactical nuclear weapons for use on the battlefield because of how previous wars have been fought, where low-yield weapons are used occasionally during a war, while a few strategic super high-yield fusion weapons were held in reserve for the oncoming nuclear war. Thanks for watching my video. A lot of this is educated speculation and assumptions based on what we know about the lore, so don't quote me as a scientific source. If you enjoy, leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below if you have any ideas or topics you want me to cover in the future, and until then I will see you in the next video.